and unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Welcome, everyone. Please sit comfortably. Welcome to everybody online. We're having the first Zazen Kai of this year, 2023. Hopefully we will have more. All day sit. A really great opportunity to observe our minds, train our minds, and enjoy our minds as best as we can. I'd like to talk about compassion. It's so ubiquitous in our society and in our lives that we can sometimes not even notice how much compassion we are receiving and how much compassionate action we are engaging in. All species, and you could say, have some degree of compassion built into their capacity to survive. Even animals that don't have much social involvement, like the mother lays the eggs and never sees her children again. Even in that process, the choosing of the place for the eggs to be laid, the conditions of that place are very careful, and they're done to ensure the survival of the offspring. And as more social structures develop among different species, the opportunities for active, compassionate action increase. And in humans, we totally and utterly depend upon the actions of others from the very moment of our birth, and for the lot of the time that we're in utero, even before birth. Even if a mother were to not know she was pregnant, she is still caring for her body, and other people are caring for her body. So we're receiving the kindness of others even before we see daylight. The amount of care that we receive is incalculable. By the time we're 6 months old, we wouldn't be able to record the amount of kindness that we have received. Sometimes I look at people and think with a kind of amazement that they're alive. Like, if they are alive, that means they have been receiving enough kindness to have not died for all of that amount of time that they're alive. Like if they're 37, for 37 years, they've been receiving all sorts of kindnesses to make it possible for them to still be alive. So every person on the whole planet, that they are alive is a testament to how essential to the fabric of our existence is compassion. And we also know, very sadly, that when people don't get enough, I mean, if they definitely don't get enough, then they do die. But if they don't get generally enough, then they are atrophied in some ways, physically, psychologically. Compassion isn't an extra, it's an essential. It's part of being alive, to receive and to give compassionately to each other. I remember many years ago, I was probably maybe in my 20s, I saw an article about a mother. She was in Australia and she was a single mother of 3 children, but had no family here. And for whatever reason, she felt a very strong need to go back to her home country for maybe 10 days. And her children were something like 9, 7, and 5, something like that. And she made the very difficult decision, which clearly was not a skillful decision, to leave her children in the house and go overseas for 10 days and set them up as best as she could with food in the fridge and little post-its explaining everything, all the things, their clothes laid out, their toys, plenty of toilet paper in the bathroom, like everything she could think of. She laid it all out, trained the oldest child to care for the siblings, did her very best, and then locked the door and went overseas. And as we can all kind of imagine, it only took a few days for things to unravel for those 3 children. Fridge door was left open, food was left on the counter, ants got in the honey, youngest child had a toileting accident, oldest child couldn't figure out how to manage it. You know, it all started to unravel for those 3 children. And they ended up on the 3rd day at the windowsill, just staring out onto the suburban street, waiting for their mother to come home. And a neighbour noticed this repeatedly. These 3 children were just out a windowsill staring, looking very sad. And however they did that, whether they called the police for a welfare check or they went and checked on the children, I don't recall, but it became clear that these children were alone and so on. Social services came in and rescued them, and I don't know the outcome for the mother. But I remember at the time reading that and feeling compassion for the mother, even though what she did was unskillful, but I don't know the circumstances of her life. She must have had a very strong desire to go overseas and see her relatives. Maybe someone was dying that she loved and she had no other support. But mostly I'd thought about just the fragility of life. When we don't get the support, things unravel. There's such a poignant example of how things unravel for us if we don't get support, and how things unravel for other people when we don't give them support. We receive it and we give it. And often we think of compassion as action-oriented, but actually in the Buddhist tradition, we focus more on the mental aspect of wishing. Our wish is for others to be relieved of suffering. We have that wish, we cultivate that wish in our Zazen practice, in our daily life. Like in that example, it would be very easy to have a somewhat dualistic attitude and go, oh, those poor children, that terrible mother. But our practice wouldn't be to do that. Our practice would be to imagine being that mother and imagining her circumstances that she made such a choice. Not just the immediate circumstances, the whole upbringing of her life that led her to feel that that was something that was an option. We'd have compassion for her in our minds. In practice, we wouldn't have to do anything because we're not involved and we couldn't be involved. but in our minds, we would cultivate compassion towards that mother as well as the children. So our practice is to focus on the wish for all beings to be relieved of suffering, trusting that in cultivating the wish, our actions will follow in whatever ways naturally arise for our actions to follow. So we can have a wish for people to not be suffering, but we don't do anything about it directly because it's not practical for us to. But it is practical for us to care for our own family and whoever enters our orbit. So we hold the wish for all beings. But in practice, we do what we can. And Zazen is the place where we get to notice what our minds are like. We get to notice whether we are cultivating that wish. And we can notice just very simple little examples, don't have to be grand examples. I shared this in the koan class yesterday, that I had a very tiny little example for myself where someone gave me some advice and I was already aware of that advice. And so I had this momentary bit of impatience and I just went, yeah. And they gave me this bit of advice. And then they gave me the advice again more strongly. In hindsight, I realized because they felt not heard by me. But my response when they gave me the advice again was to go, yeah. yeah. And that was the end of the conversation, very short. But afterwards, 10 minutes or so afterwards, I thought, that was not a very satisfying exchange. And I thought about how maybe the other person wasn't feeling heard by me. And I felt warm towards them, that I'd actually acted in a way that made them feel a little unheard. And so I just went back and said, sorry if I was a little sharp or blunt or quick. I can't remember what word I used a few minutes ago. You're really right about that. And I'll endeavour to remember that bit of advice. And then that felt really good. So it was a tiny little moment. It wasn't big. But when we do Zazen, particularly if we have a daily practice, our mind starts to become attuned to these tiny little moments, and we are more likely to act more skillfully in a way that really cares for others. And for us, often in our society, it's to care for their mental state. Our physical needs are often fairly well taken care of. Often it's more these psychological needs that we have got a lot of scope to do better, or to do well, just to do well. So I want to talk about great compassion. One of our great teachers, great philosophers in the 4th and 5th century, Vasubandhu, wrote about great compassion. And to talk about it, I need to talk a little bit about what we could call ordinary compassion. And not wanting ordinary compassion to sound kind of critical. It's just to say that there's a range of the way we can function in terms of compassion. And the general conventional way in our society in relation to compassion, even though it's all pervading and we're all doing it, it still has some limits. So most people, we could say, when they're feeling compassion, there's a limit for whom compassion is given. It can be conscious and it can be unconscious. In other words, people may not notice that there are limits to who they feel compassion for. It's not so much about the action as the thinking. They may not notice the limits of who they feel compassion for, Or they may quite comfortably notice the limits and are very clear, oh no, I don't have any compassion for people like that. Or I don't care about, some people maybe think fish have no feelings, so I don't care at all about fish, or whatever. People might quite consciously know where their limits are. But for many of us, we don't notice exactly where our limits are. The limits are usually related to things like we tend to feel more compassion for people or beings that feel more like us, that we can relate to, which is often why people maybe have more compassion for animals that are sort of like mammals, less so than maybe lizards, would be a good example of that. Or more compassion for people in your own country than for people in a different country, or in your town or suburb rather than some other place. So people that we feel some similarity to on various different axes, we're more likely to have compassion towards them. And we also have compassion towards often things, people or other beings that we have some sympathy for. It can be people who have been in a natural disaster. Often you notice that culturally, that people tend to rise up and support people when there's a natural disaster. We seem to have a strong collective response to natural disasters, but maybe not quite such a strong natural response to the trials and tribulations of poverty, for example. Might be a little less sense of sympathy and empathy toward that. Sometimes people have a sense of, well, it's their own fault. Quite a sharp line is demarcated in the sand. We'll often have sympathy and therefore feelings of compassion if people have had accidents, or if we see images particularly that bring those feelings to the surface in us. If we, there's a famous photograph of the turtle that had a plastic straw stuck up its nose. And that, I actually knew one of the main people in the United States who was behind the global campaign to get rid of plastic straws and had been working for years. And when that photo became a viral image, her work suddenly like exploded and she had great success. That one image captured people's imagination, and a feeling of sympathy and empathy just flowed out of people. Which I think also, as a side point, is another way of helping us see that Buddha nature is our birthright, that people accidentally are unkind a lot of the time. And then when they're given something very visceral, they'll suddenly spontaneously be kind, even to a turtle. Like the image of the turtle, people related to it with a sense of equality. This turtle, they felt it themselves. People imagined, oh, what would that be like? Have a straw up one's nose. Oh my God, that'll be so horrible. People that normally wouldn't have that feeling did. But as practitioners, we don't want to have to wait for things like that to happen for us to be cultivating compassion. So regular compassion, ordinary compassion tends to be selective. And the other quality of ordinary compassion is what we focus on. Ordinary compassion tends to focus on wanting things to go better for people in all the various ways that we like things to go better for people. For kids to do well at school, for people to have a good job, to have a good social life, to have enough money, all those sorts of regular things. But most of us also know, at least in some part of our mind, that things going well can't happen every single day for our whole life. We can wish for things to go well for people, but part of us knows that it's not actually going to keep going well for people every single minute. So wanting things to go well for people in terms of the material physical world or the world of appearances, the world of things that come and things go, things arrive and things leave, things are made and things break. Wanting that to go well for people has its limitation, because clearly it's not going to always. It's a bit like if you're playing cards, you just can't get a good hand every time. And it would be a bit silly to wish it for someone. Just hope you always get the best hand. We all know that's not going to happen. Or in sport, you just can't win every game. It would just be completely uninteresting for everybody else if one team always won every game. The natural flow in terms of the phenomenal world is things to ebb and flow. Good days, bad days, good days, bad days. Average days, really good days, average days, really bad days. It's the way of it. But normal, ordinary compassion tends to focus more on wanting things to go well for people. So great compassion is the bringing together of compassion with wisdom. When we are compassionate and wise, the effect, the scope, and the quality of our compassion is boundless. Compassion and wisdom together alters the way we function compassionately. And the wisdom, talk about that forever. We do talk about that forever. What is the wisdom in our teachings? Maybe this a fairly simple way is that we see the interpenetration of all things. We see that everything relies upon everything else to the degree that nothing exists as a separate independent thing. And the more we contemplate this in our practice, in our zazen and in our studies, and feel the truth of this profound interdependence, interpenetration of all things, and we start to lose the belief in a separate self and a separate other, as we really start to see that that is just a convention, a convenient convention, a useful convention, but nevertheless a convention, and we really feel that there's no actual self, there's no actual other. When we deeply realize that, great compassion arrives. An alternative word for emptiness, which is recognizing no self and no other, is boundlessness, which I think is a very instructive word. When we can start to see the world past the superficial appearance of separateness, like right now in this room, on a superficial level, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the Zendo and 7 people on the screen. When we can see past that and see the boundlessness, the lack of boundary between each of us and between all the objects in this room. And of course, we can just go on and on and on. We've still got food in our tummies. Where did it come from? There are farmers, there is soil, there is rain. You know, we could just go on and on. When we feel the truth of that, then our compassion also knows no bounds. Our compassion is not limited to things that relate to us personally, because as we lose the sense of a personal self, there isn't so much a sense of this is more familiar and that is less familiar. It doesn't feel that way so much anymore. So we can feel compassion boundlessly. We can feel compassion for whether someone or some being is different or similar to us, or whether we kind of superficially like them or not. I mean, I think liking and disliking becomes less of even a feeling that one has, but I guess one could superficially like some people a little bit more than other people, or maybe feel some fondness more for certain species than other species. But from great compassion, that doesn't really, it's not really a factor. The compassion is there anyway. And we feel compassion whether we understand or not. We don't need an explanation. We don't need to explain to me why. And then if I understand and I agree with your reasoning, then I'll have compassion for you. We don't need to know why. We don't need to understand. We'll feel compassion for someone even if their actions seem quite really hard to comprehend. We can't imagine. Although I do think that if we practice, we can always imagine why somebody does something. Not necessarily accurately, but that's not the point. But creatively, we can imagine, we can somehow wrap our mind around, I could sort of see how somebody could do that. But we don't even need to. From great compassion, whether we understand or not, we feel compassion for them. We wish them to be free from suffering. Even beings that we can't imagine or that we don't even know about, we can feel compassion for them. We can in our mind have a wish for anything I know nothing of. I wish you to not be suffering. There are other realms outside the physical realm that I know nothing of. I wish beings there to not be suffering. If there are other planets with life on them, I wish everything to be going as well as possible for you. So great compassion does care still about the ordinary things, like with great compassion, you still do want people to have enough food and enough shelter and maybe to win an award. It's not that great compassion doesn't also include those things, it does. So it's boundless in terms of toward whom, but it also increases the range of what we feel compassion about. So including regular compassion of wishing things to go well for people on just a regular mundane level, conventional level. What we really wish for is for beings to understand the causes of suffering, to understand the source of suffering for themselves. We wish for them to cultivate wisdom and see the interdependence of all beings, to understand impermanence, that anything we're attached to will pass away, so that people can appreciate it while it's there and be a little less devastated when it's gone. Appreciate freedom while we have it, because at some point maybe it'll be gone. Maybe it'll be gone in the way that we might lose our capacity to feed ourselves, so we've lost that freedom. So while we can feed ourselves, be good for us to appreciate it. So we want that for beings. We want other beings to know the causes of suffering and to know how to liberate themselves from suffering by understanding the basic wisdom teachings of impermanence, of no self. The Buddha nature teachings, which we won't have time to go into today, but really at the most simple level is to recognize that we're all essentially okay and not bad, that there's no essential badness in anybody. That anybody who behaves badly does so because of conditions, and if we'd had exactly the same conditions, we'd be behaving just as badly. So to not judge people that way, to really and see them more like the purity of a newborn child. So even when we've practiced for a long time and have studied the Buddhist wisdom traditions, in the teachings, most of us are not totally purified. We're not totally wise. Most of us will still have some sort of cognitive, emotional places where we get tripped up a little bit. Like that example I gave of me going, yeah, yeah, to someone. Just for that moment, I was slightly tripped up. Just in that moment, I was a little impatient with someone. And so we just keep on practicing. We notice those moments and we keep practicing. No drama, no big deal. We take on the aspiration to be fully purified, to be fully free of delusion, so that we are completely open-hearted. And that open-heartedness includes caring for ourselves. Sometimes people think, well, if I'm that open-hearted, I won't look after myself. But the open-heartedness includes ourselves. And on a practical level, it makes much more sense for us to each care for ourselves. Like, it makes a lot more sense for me to feed myself than to expect somebody else to feed me, in terms of literally putting the food in my mouth. So there's a lot of things we do for ourselves because it's just much more practical for us to do it. Best for us to take care of our sleep schedule, make sure we're hydrated, and so on. So we do that. We're part of the open-hearted compassion includes towards ourselves. Gosh, I had some more. Oh yeah, there's two other points I wanted to mention. It's a bird doing some funny things out there. Maybe it's trying to listen. Another thing about great compassion, so besides limitless and wishing for beings to understand the causes of suffering, other qualities about great compassion that are a little different to ordinary compassion is the discomfort, you could say, that we might feel in witnessing and knowing about others' suffering. We don't mind. The suffering of compassion is experienced as a joy when we coming from a place of wisdom. So things like burnout aren't really a thing when we're coming from a place of real wisdom. We don't mind the tiredness. We don't mind the pain of knowing about the suffering. We experience that as a joy. I think this is difficult to understand, but it's so. And we can imagine it and say, I would like to be like that. The joy of suffering, the joy of joining with the suffering of others. It's experienced as a joy, not as a burden. And another aspect of great compassion is when we are filled with compassion and wisdom, we feel responsible for all the suffering in the world. We feel a responsibility, and that responsibility also isn't felt as a burden. It's not experienced as guilt. It's not experienced as a heavy weight. It's just a heartfelt feeling of connectedness because there's no boundary. I felt this a little recently where I lived in Santa Cruz. North of there was a terrible shooting just a few weeks ago. And I remember really feeling this heartfelt sense of, oh, that's my place. And I felt for the whole thing. It was on a mushroom farm, and I thought, maybe I've eaten mushrooms from that farm. And I felt for the man who shot his co-workers, and for the poverty that they were all in, and I feel a part of that poverty that helped construct that poverty by being a member of that society. But it wasn't a painful, it wasn't hard, it wasn't a heavy feeling. It was just this feeling of wishing for this suffering to end for beings, wishing for them to all understand. Like all the people, I imagined the police and the bosses at the farm and people who lived in that town and people who lived in the neighboring towns, all the different distresses that they would be feeling. So wishing for them, not just to be relieved of it, but to understand it, to understand why they were feeling maybe anger or confusion or fear, whatever emotions were generated by that event, wishing for them to understand it, to understand the source of it, so that then they would be able to relieve it for themselves and be able to help others relieve it. Because just trying to relieve the bits and pieces, like the deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing, just trying to rearrange the bits and pieces would be very limited. So that's why we do things like sit all day, to cultivate compassion, this great compassion. It's boundless, that wishes beings to be wise and understand the source of suffering and the liberation from suffering. And we're willing to take on the responsibility for it, and we're willing to joyfully carry the pain of it. And we're included in that. It's all of us. We're all including ourselves in that. We're not left out. We're not being martyrs. We're not left out of that. It's including ourselves. So some of us will be sitting all day, and some people online will be heading on for the rest of your day. So let's just hold this idea of great compassion and imagine that we can cultivate it in ourselves. We'll finish with our chant. It's on the little cards there. And then all stand and do 3 bows, and people can join us on Zoom, can do some bowing as well. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. So now we'll do 10 minutes of Kinhin, and then one more period of sitting, and then we'll take a break.